My name is Chloe Vance, and for as long as I could remember, my life had been painted in muted tones, a stark contrast to the vibrant, almost blinding hues that seemed to define everyone else in my family. I was 28 years old, residing in a small, perpetually dust-moted apartment in the heart of Brooklyn, New York. The city's relentless pulse was a constant backdrop to my own quiet struggle, a symphony of ambition and despair. My apartment wasn't just a living space, it was also my sanctuary, my battleground, and my studio. Canvases leaned precariously against every available surface, tubes of paint lay scattered like forgotten jewels, and the faint, intoxicating scent of turpentine clung to the air, a scent far more comforting than any expensive perfume. My jewels. Mother favored. Art, specifically painting, was my lifeline. It was the only place where I felt truly seen, truly alive. In the chaotic strokes of oil on canvas, in the delicate dance of watercolor, I found a voice that was stifled everywhere else. My pieces often depicted fractured landscapes, figures shrouded in shadow, or solitary lights burning against an immense darkness. Reflections, I supposed, of my own internal world. But passion, as I had quickly learned, didn't pay the rent. My days were a grueling rhythm of minimum-wage jobs, a barista at a bustling coffee shop in Bushwick by morning, a dog walker navigating the concrete canyons of Park Slope in the afternoon. Evenings were reserved for my true calling, hours stolen from sleep, fueled by lukewarm coffee and an unwavering, almost desperate hope that one day my art would speak loud enough for the world to listen. And maybe, just maybe, for my family to notice. My family, the Vances. The name itself carried a weight, a certain sheen of undeniable prestige and old money. They inhabited a sprawling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a world away from my cramped Brooklyn walk-up, both geographically and metaphorically. The house, with its manicured lawns and towering oak trees, was less a home and more a monument to their impeccable taste and even more impeccable social standing. My parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vance, were paragons of this carefully constructed image. My father, a shrewd real estate mogul, and my mother, a tireless philanthropic socialite, lived for appearances. Their lives revolved around board meetings, charity galas, and maintaining a flawless facade, one that rarely allowed for the inconvenient, messy truths of genuine human emotion. Then there was Eleanor. My older sister, 32, was the centerpiece of their carefully curated tableau, the undisputed golden child. Eleanor was by all external measures perfect. She had graduated summa cum laude from an Ivy League university, secured a coveted position at a top-tier investment bank in Manhattan, and was at least until recently engaged to a man whose family name was as prominent as our own. She possessed an effortless grace, a sharp wit, and a beauty that was both classic and intimidating. My parents adored her, openly showering her with praise opportunities and an unwavering belief in her boundless potential. To them, Eleanor was the embodiment of everything they valued: success, status, and the perpetuation of the Vance legacy. I, on the other hand, was merely Chloe, the artist, the dreamer, the one who in their eyes seemed destined to always fall short. I still remember the last family dinner just a few weeks ago before the storm truly hit. It was a Sunday evening, the kind where the autumn air outside was crisp and inside the grand dining room of the Vance estate was bathed in the warm glow of candlelight. The table was laden with expensive china and crystal, the aroma of roasted duck filling the air. It was a scene of domestic bliss, carefully staged, expertly performed. I had driven all the way from Brooklyn, dreading the familiar routine. As soon as I walked in, I could feel the invisible wall, the subtle chill in the air that always seemed to surround me. My mother, in a designer dress, greeted me with a polite, almost detached air, saying she hoped my drive hadn't been too tiring. My father, from behind his copy of the Wall Street Journal, simply offered a curt nod, his attention barely flickering from the financial pages. Eleanor, on the other hand, was radiant. She had just secured a major deal at her firm, a complex merger that had earned her a significant bonus and the admiration of her superiors. My parents couldn't stop talking about it, their voices filled with a pride that felt like a physical blow to my own chest. My father proudly announced that Eleanor had closed the biggest deal of her career and that her promotion was practically guaranteed. My mother added that Eleanor was truly a force to be reckoned with, the kind of daughter any parent would dream of having. Eleanor, with a practiced modesty that I knew all too well, simply smiled, saying it was just a matter of hard work and dedication. Every word they spoke, every admiring glance they cast at her, felt like a spotlight shining on my own inadequacy. I sat there trying to make myself as small as possible, picking at my food, the taste of it like ash in my mouth. Eventually, as if remembering I was present, my mother turned to me, asking me with a faint, polite smile if my little art projects were still keeping me busy. It wasn't a question of genuine interest, but a veiled barb. I tried to explain my recent efforts, describing a series of small cityscapes I was working on, trying to convey the passion that consumed me. I told them I was exploring new techniques with acrylics, trying to capture the transient beauty of urban decay. My father immediately interjected, saying he still thought it was time for me to consider a more practical path. He said that while hobbies were fine, a person needed a career, something with a tangible future. My mother chimed in, suggesting I could perhaps take a few business courses, reminding me that Eleanor had always balanced her interests with her responsibilities so beautifully. She said that not everyone could be a starving artist, and that perhaps it was time for me to be more realistic. The familiar sting of their words, the crushing weight of their dismissal settled over me. I felt a familiar urge to defend myself, to shout that my art was my future, that it was far more real to me than any spreadsheet or corporate merger. But I knew it was useless. Their minds were already made up, their narrative of my life already written. I simply mumbled that I was managing, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. My efforts were met with a dismissive wave from my father, who then turned back to Eleanor, asking her about her next career move, completely forgetting my existence. This wasn't new. This was my life, a tapestry woven with threads of subtle neglect and overt favoritism. The memories, like old wounds, would occasionally ache. I remembered my 10th birthday, a day I had eagerly anticipated. I had wanted a small easel and a set of professional paints. Instead, my mother had given me a generic art kit, saying it was good enough, while simultaneously planning a lavish party for Eleanor a week later to celebrate her winning a regional science fair award. I remembered my mother telling me with a strange smile that we needed to make Eleanor feel special because she was under a lot of pressure, and that my birthday could always be celebrated another time. The easel never materialized. Another time, when I was in high school, Eleanor had gotten into trouble for cheating on a history exam. I had accidentally seen her study notes filled with copied answers. When the school called my parents, instead of confronting Eleanor, had somehow managed to shift suspicion onto me, implying I had copied from Eleanor, and then made me stay home for a week, supposedly to reflect on my actions. My mother had pulled me aside later, telling me that Eleanor had a scholarship at stake, and that I needed to be understanding and protect her sister's future. My father had added that I was the more resilient one, the one who could handle a little misunderstanding. I carried that unspoken burden, that silent accusation, for weeks, feeling a deep, bitter resentment bloom within me. It cemented the unspoken rule: Eleanor's perfection, Eleanor's future always came first. My feelings, my truth, were secondary or simply expendable. I often felt like a ghost in my own home, a phantom limb that they occasionally acknowledged but never truly embraced. My dreams were viewed as childish whims, my struggles as self-inflicted inconveniences. I was in their carefully constructed world, merely a supporting character meant to enhance Eleanor's narrative, to be a quiet counterpoint to her brilliance. Yet, despite this emotional landscape of constant dismissal, a tiny ember of hope still flickered within me. It was fueled by my unwavering love for art, the belief that my hands held something unique, something worth sharing. And that ember was about to be fanned into a tentative flame. One crisp October morning, while scrolling through an art industry blog during a break at the coffee shop, I stumbled upon an announcement that made my heart leap. The Phoenix Arts Foundation, a renowned organization dedicated to fostering emerging talent, had opened applications for their annual Phoenix Rising Fellowship. It wasn't just another grant. It was the grant. The description read like a blueprint for my deepest desires: a substantial stipend to cover living expenses for a full year, a dedicated, fully equipped studio space in a vibrant artistic community, and perhaps most importantly, mentorship from established artists whose work I deeply admired. It was in essence a year of pure, unadulterated artistic freedom, a chance to shed the burden of my part-time jobs and immerse myself completely in my craft. This wasn't just about money or space. It was about validation, about finally having the opportunity to prove my worth, not just to my family but to myself. The application process was rigorous, demanding a compelling portfolio of my best work, a detailed project proposal outlining my artistic vision for the year, and several letters of recommendation. It felt daunting yet exhilarating. This was my shot, my one tangible opportunity to break free from the gravitational pull of my family's expectations and carve out my own destiny. I began to pour every spare moment, every ounce of my dwindling energy into preparing my application. My small apartment transformed into a whirlwind of sketches, paint, and carefully typed essays. I dreamt of the possibilities, of the quiet satisfaction of creating without the constant hum of financial anxiety or the gnawing ache of familial disapproval. But even as this new hope bloomed within me, a subtle shift was occurring in Eleanor's perfectly polished world. I started noticing small cracks in her facade. She called less frequently, her usual confident voice replaced by a strained, brittle tone. One afternoon, I caught a snippet of a phone conversation between her and my mother. My mother's voice, usually so composed, was sharp with concern. I overheard phrases like problems at the firm and financial entanglements. Then a few days later, a brief, tense interaction with Eleanor herself. She arrived unannounced at my Brooklyn apartment, something she almost never did, looking unusually disheveled. She claimed she was just in the neighborhood, but her eyes, usually so bright and commanding, held a haunted, restless quality. She spoke in vague terms about stress at work and a misunderstanding with David, her then fiancé. I offered her a cup of tea, a rare gesture of peace. She accepted, her hands trembling slightly as she held the warm mug. She mentioned something about her engagement being called off, citing irreconcilable differences, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. There was a raw, uncharacteristic vulnerability in her eyes that made me uneasy. She didn't stay long, quickly making an excuse to leave, but her visit left a lingering sense of foreboding. It was a fleeting glimpse behind the curtain of her carefully constructed perfection, a hint that the golden girl might not be so golden after all. The full extent of her troubles was still obscured, a dark cloud gathering on the horizon, but I could feel its presence. As I returned to my easel, the promise of the Phoenix Rising Fellowship shimmering before me, a strange dichotomy settled in. On one hand, there was the burgeoning excitement, the almost dizzying prospect of finally pursuing my dreams unfettered. On the other, there was the unsettling sense that Eleanor's perfect world was crumbling, and the uneasy feeling that somehow, even in her downfall, I might still be drawn into her orbit, destined to once again play a part in her drama, a role I desperately wanted to escape. My hope for freedom clashed with the subtle, insidious tendrils of family obligation, a silent warning of the storm that was rapidly approaching. The first brushstroke of my new life was about to collide with the first tremor of her collapse, and I had a chilling premonition that the impact would be devastating. The scent of oil paint, rich and earthy, was my solace. My small Brooklyn studio apartment, usually a haven of quiet contemplation, had transformed into a whirlwind of creative energy. The Phoenix Arts Foundation Fellowship application consumed my every waking, non-working moment. I taped reference photos of bustling cityscapes and serene natural landscapes to my wall, ideas for my project proposals swirling in my mind like the pigments on my palette. This wasn't just another application. This was the bridge to a life I had only ever dared to dream of. A life where my art was not a forgotten hobby but my entire existence. A life where I might finally truly belong to myself. I spent hours poring over my portfolio, critiquing each piece with a new, almost brutal honesty. The fellowship demanded not just talent but vision, resilience. I wanted to show them the depth of my soul, the stories etched into my very being through years of unspoken battles. I found myself instinctively reaching for darker, more somber tones, shades that reflected the internal landscapes I had been navigating since childhood. But I also added unexpected bursts of vivid color, a defiant splash of cerulean blue or a fierce cadmium red, symbolizing the resilient ember of hope that had stubbornly refused to die within me. This application felt like a confession, a testament, a prayer. Just as I felt the pieces of my proposal finally clicking into place, the illusion of peace shattered. My phone, usually a quiet companion, buzzed with an insistent ring. It was my mother. My stomach tightened instantly. My mother rarely called me directly unless it was an obligation or more often a crisis involving Eleanor. I took a deep breath, trying to brace myself, and answered. Chloe, her voice, usually so composed, was laced with an unfamiliar tremor, a brittle edge that immediately put me on high alert. You need to come home, now. I asked what was wrong, my voice betraying the anxiety coiling in my gut. My mother's response was a torrent of frantic, almost hysterical words. She told me that Eleanor was in deep trouble. She had lost her job at the investment bank, not just quit but fired under a cloud of undisclosed financial irregularities. Her engagement to David had indeed ended, but it wasn't a mutual decision. David had broken it off after discovering Eleanor had accumulated an astronomical amount of gambling debt money she had apparently been siphoning from a joint account they had shared, and even more alarmingly from their parents' own investment accounts to which she had privileged access. My mother said that Eleanor was completely unhinged, that she had locked herself in her room, threatening to do something drastic. My father, she said, was beside himself, yelling, pacing on the verge of a heart attack. She said it was a complete catastrophe, an absolute ruin of their family name. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because of Eleanor's plight, but because of the sheer scale of the deception, the carefully constructed illusion that had now imploded so spectacularly. Eleanor, the perfect one, the golden child, had been living a lie, a house of cards built on debt and deceit. And my parents, who had always championed her flawless image, were now facing its ugly unraveling. I asked what they expected me to do. My mother's voice hardened, shifting from panic to a tone I recognized all too well, one of command laced with guilt. She said that I was family, and that family stuck together. She said that this was an emergency of the highest order, and that I needed to put my own trivial concerns aside. She said, Eleanor needed me. I felt a familiar bitter taste in my mouth. Eleanor needed me. It was always Eleanor. Not for comfort, not for genuine support, but for damage control. For me to be the resilient one, the one who could quietly absorb the fallout. I packed a small bag, my hands moving mechanically. The excitement for the fellowship application, which had just moments ago felt so vibrant, now seemed distant, almost frivolous. As I drove the familiar route from Brooklyn to Greenwich, the city lights fading into the suburban sprawl, my mind drifted back through the years, memories surfacing like fragmented photographs. I remembered my 16th birthday, a quiet affair. I had wanted to celebrate with my best friend Sarah, perhaps a movie and dinner. But that week, Eleanor had been caught shoplifting a designer scarf from a high-end boutique. My parents, terrified of a scandal, had covered it up, paying off the store manager and ensuring no charges were pressed. They then told me with grave faces that Eleanor was under immense stress and that her lapse in judgment meant the family needed to present a united front. They canceled my birthday plans instead, insisting I accompany Eleanor to therapy sessions she didn't attend, effectively acting as her chaperone to keep her out of trouble and maintain appearances. My mother had later told me that I was stronger than Eleanor, that I could handle a little disappointment, but Eleanor couldn't afford any more setbacks. I remembered feeling a cold, heavy resentment watching Eleanor get away with a serious offense while I was punished for merely existing. My sweet 16 had become Eleanor's damage control. Another memory, sharper, more painful, my graduation from college. I had worked tirelessly, putting myself through state university with scholarships and part-time jobs, proud of earning my BFA in fine arts. My parents had attended, of course, dutifully. But the entire conversation at the post-graduation dinner had revolved around Eleanor's recent promotion at the bank, her brilliant mind, her unquestionable future. When I tried to talk about my own plans for an art career, my father had scoffed, saying that perhaps I should apply for an MBA just like Eleanor to have a backup plan. My mother had added with a condescending smile that art was lovely, but it was just a hobby, and that Eleanor understood the real world. I remember the hollow ache in my chest, the feeling that my achievement, my hard-won degree, was invisible, inconsequential in the dazzling light of Eleanor's real success. These were not isolated incidents. They were the building blocks of my childhood, the quiet scaffolding that held up Eleanor's perfect world while subtly crushing mine. I was the silent observer, the emotional sponge, the convenient scapegoat. Arriving at the Vance estate, the imposing gates seemed to loom larger than usual, a symbol of the gilded cage I was about to re-enter. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, a stark contrast to the frantic phone call. My mother met me at the door, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. My father was in the study, a half-empty tumbler of scotch in his hand, his usual commanding presence diminished by a palpable air of defeat. "She's refusing to come out," my mother whispered, clutching my arm. "She won't talk to anyone. David won't even answer our calls." I asked what the full extent of the damage was. My father, emerging from the study, his voice rough with suppressed anger and fear, finally laid out the devastating truth. Eleanor's gambling debt wasn't just substantial, it was crippling, over $1 million. She had not only gambled away her own savings and David's, but had meticulously siphoned money from a trust fund my grandmother had set up for both Eleanor and me, a fund that was meant to be untouched until we were 40. And even worse, she had forged documents to access some of my parents' investment accounts, convinced she could win it all back. He said that her boss, a senior partner at the bank, was furious, threatening to press charges for embezzlement if the money wasn't returned immediately. Their family name, he declared, was on the brink of utter humiliation. I felt a cold dread spread through me. My grandmother's trust fund. The fund that held the small, invaluable piece of land in Vermont, a rustic cabin and a few acres that my grandmother had specifically left to me, knowing my artistic inclinations, a place I had always dreamed of converting into my future studio if the fellowship didn't work out. It was my backup, my ultimate escape route. My father's next words confirmed my worst fears. "We need you to help Chloe," he said, his voice now, devoid of its usual condescension, replaced by a desperate urgency that was almost unsettling. "Eleanor needs to go to a specialized clinic, a discreet one, to deal with her issues. And we need to pay back the bank immediately. To avoid a scandal." My mother stepped forward, her hands clasped, her eyes pleading. She told me that Eleanor was their daughter and that they had to protect her, protect the family's reputation. She said that this was an emergency and that true family put everything aside for each other. Then came the demand, the knife twisting deeper into the old wound. "We need you to sell the land Grandma Evelyn left you," my father stated, his gaze unyielding. "Or if you can't manage that quickly enough, transfer all your savings to us. It will cover a significant portion of what Eleanor owes. It's the only way, Chloe. Eleanor's future, our family's honor. It depends on you." I stared at them, my mind reeling. Sell the land. My grandmother's legacy, the very foundation of my artistic dreams, the potential site for my Phoenix studio, or drain my meager savings, the last vestiges of my financial independence, the buffer against total destitution. All for Eleanor, for her colossal mistakes, for their desperate attempt to maintain a facade that had long since cracked and crumbled. I found my voice thin but resolute. "No," I said, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "I can't. That land, that's my future. And I have the Phoenix Fellowship application. This is my chance, my only chance, to make something of myself, to actually build a life based on my art." My father's face contorted with rage. "Your art," he spat, the disdain returning to his voice, amplified by his stress. "Your art is a childish fantasy. Chloe Eleanor is facing criminal charges. Our family name could be dragged through the mud. This is a real crisis, not some paint-by-numbers project." My mother, tears welling in her eyes, approached me, her voice dripping with guilt-tripping manipulation. She said I was being selfish, incredibly selfish. She reminded me of all the sacrifices they had made for me, for my education, for my frivolous pursuits. She said Eleanor was their firstborn, their pride, and that I, as her sister, had a moral obligation to help her. She said that Olivia was drowning and that I was standing idly by, clinging to a piece of dirt when my sister's life was falling apart. She even dared to say that Grandma Evelyn, if she were alive, would have wanted me to do the right thing to help family in need. That particular jab hit me the hardest. My grandmother, the only one who truly understood me, whose quiet encouragement had sustained me through years of neglect. To invoke her name in this twisted plea was an insult. I remembered Grandma Evelyn, her gentle hands, the way her eyes would light up when she looked at my drawings. She was the one who bought me my first real art set, not a child's kit, but professional watercolors, telling me that my talent was a gift and that I should cherish it. She was the one who often took me on long walks in the woods near her Vermont cabin, pointing out the subtle shifts in light and shadow, encouraging me to see the world with an artist's eye. She was the one who always told me to hold on to my dreams, Chloe, for they are the truest part of you. She wouldn't have wanted this. She wouldn't have wanted me to sacrifice my essence for someone else's failures, especially not for the sake of maintaining a false image. I repeated my refusal, my voice shaking but firm. "I cannot. I won't. This is my life. I'm not giving it up." My parents' reaction was swift and brutal. My father slammed his fist on the polished mahogany table, making the crystal glasses rattle. He said that if I wouldn't help, then I was no daughter of his. My mother, dissolving into theatrical sobs, accused me of having a cold, unfeeling heart, of lacking any sense of loyalty. She said she couldn't believe she had raised such an ungrateful child. She said they would manage without my pathetic help, but that I would live to regret my selfishness. She said I would see how alone I would be, how truly alone without their support. The venom in their words, the absolute dismissal of my humanity, burned a fresh wound in me. It wasn't just about the land or the money anymore. It was about the complete erasure of my existence as an individual, a person with her own dreams and needs. To them, I was merely a resource, a tool to be used, a problem to be discarded once my utility ran out. The following days were a relentless siege. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from my parents, voicemails filled with alternating pleas, threats, and guilt trips. My mother would call, her voice trembling, describing Eleanor's fragile state, implying that my refusal was pushing her over the edge. My father would call, his tone colder, more authoritative, reminding me of my moral obligations and the catastrophic consequences of my defiance. They even started calling relatives, weaving a narrative that painted me as the heartless, ungrateful sister turning everyone against me. My Aunt Carol, usually a sweet, unassuming woman, called me, her voice strained, saying that I needed to remember where I came from and that family was everything. My cousin Michael, whom I had always considered a friend, sent me a curt email expressing his disappointment in my lack of support for Eleanor during her difficult time. I felt a suffocating loneliness, an isolation that mirrored my childhood, but intensified by the awareness of their calculated manipulation. My carefully built emotional walls, which I had spent years constructing, began to crack under the relentless pressure. I tried to focus on my fellowship application, but the words blurred before my eyes. The vibrant colors on my palette seemed to dull. How could I articulate my dreams when my very right to dream was being contested, torn apart by the very people who should have been my strongest advocates? Every brushstroke felt heavy-laden with unspoken accusations. Every word I typed for my project proposal felt like a lie, a betrayal of the despair that was slowly creeping into my heart. My energy dwindled. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, tormented by endless replays of my parents' accusations, their faces contorted in anger and disappointment. Food lost its taste. I spent my days going through the motions at work, a zombie in a barista apron, my mind numb. My evenings, once dedicated to art, were now filled with a hollow ache, a profound sense of exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. The hope that had ignited within me the promise of the phoenix was slowly being extinguished by the suffocating weight of their demands. I knew Eleanor was still unwell, still refusing to deal with her issues. My parents, in their desperation to control the narrative, had arranged for her to stay at their estate, a private recovery that served to keep her hidden from public scrutiny rather than truly addressing her destructive patterns. And I knew that every day I refused to comply, the pressure would only intensify. I was caught in a cruel tug-of-war, my dreams on one side, my family's toxic expectations, and Eleanor's spiraling self-destruction on the other. The rope was fraying, and I had a terrifying premonition that something would have to snap. My artistic sanctuary, my very soul, felt under siege. The next chapter, I knew, would demand a choice, a sacrifice, or a fight I had never truly been prepared for. The final week before the Phoenix Fellowship deadline was a blur of caffeine-fueled desperation and bone-deep exhaustion. The relentless barrage of calls from my parents had finally subsided, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that was in its own way even more menacing. It was the silence of judgment, the quiet condemnation of a family that had written me off. I tried to channel the turmoil, the anger, the profound sense of betrayal into my art. My project proposal, once a vibrant tapestry of hope, became a darker, more complex narrative. It was about survival, about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of suffocating darkness. It was raw, honest, and perhaps the most authentic work I had ever produced. But it was also rushed-born from sleepless nights and a mind fractured by emotional warfare. I submitted it online just hours before the deadline, my finger hovering over the send button with a sense of grim finality. I felt no elation, only the hollow emptiness of a battle fought on too many fronts. The rejection came 2 weeks later. It arrived not as a formal letter, but as a curt, impersonal email. While we were impressed with the raw emotion in your work, it read the committee felt the project proposal lacked the coherent development and polished execution required for the fellowship. The words were professional, detached, but to me they were a death sentence. Lacked coherent development. Lacked polished execution. It was a perfect clinical summary of my life at that moment. My parents had won. They had successfully sabotaged my one chance at escape, not through direct action, but through a calculated campaign of psychological erosion. I sat on the floor of my studio, the email glowing on my laptop screen, and for the first time in a long time I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard knot in my chest, a void where my dreams used to be. That same afternoon, as I was numbly trying to process the finality of my failure, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice this time was not angry or pleading, but eerily calm, almost robotic. She informed me that Eleanor had been in a car accident. She said that Eleanor had been driving home from a friend's house late last night when she lost control of the vehicle and hit a tree. She said the injuries were serious but not life-threatening. A broken leg, a fractured wrist, severe contusions. She said that Eleanor would require surgery and extensive, expensive physical therapy. The way she delivered the news felt rehearsed, devoid of genuine emotion. It was an announcement, a statement of fact that I knew with a chilling certainty was also a summons. The final nail in the coffin of my old self was hammered in the next day. My parents appeared at my apartment door unannounced. They didn't knock. They used the spare key they had insisted on keeping for emergencies. The sight of them standing in my sanctuary, my only safe space, felt like a violation of the highest order. My father's face was a mask of grim determination, My mother's was pale, her eyes holding a look of desperate theatrical sorrow. My father told me that the accident had changed everything. He said that Eleanor's medical bills would be astronomical and that her recovery would be a long, arduous process. He said that this was no longer about a gambling debt or a lost job. This was about Eleanor's physical well-being. My mother added that Eleanor was broken both physically and emotionally, and that they couldn't possibly manage this crisis alone. Then came the ultimatum. It was no longer a request, but a demand delivered with the cold finality of a judge's sentence. My father placed a stack of papers on my small kitchen table. It was a pre-filled contract for the sale of my grandmother's Vermont property along with a power of attorney form that would give them control over the transaction. He told me that I would sign it right now. He said that they had already found a buyer, a developer willing to pay cash, and that the deal needed to close within the week to cover the upfront costs of Eleanor's surgery and a private rehabilitation facility. I stared at the papers, my blood turning to ice. They hadn't even asked. They had arranged it all behind my back, treating my inheritance, my last bastion of hope, as their personal emergency fund. I told them no, my voice, a hoarse whisper. I said they couldn't do this. My mother began to weep, her sobs a calculated weapon. She said she couldn't believe I could be so cruel, so heartless. She said that my sister could be permanently disabled, and that all I could think about was a worthless piece of land and my failed art career. She even had the audacity to say that my fellowship rejection was a sign from the universe that I was meant for something else, that my true purpose was to be here supporting my family. My father took a more aggressive approach. He stepped closer, his presence looming over me in the small room. He said that I was being a fool. He said that I owed them, that I owed Eleanor. He reminded me of the roof over my head as a child, the food on my table, the education they had paid for, conveniently forgetting that I had put myself through college. He said that this was my one chance to prove my worth, to finally do something meaningful for the family. When I still refused, his voice dropped to a low, menacing growl. He said that if I didn't sign, they would make my life impossible. He threatened to cut me off completely, to tell everyone in our extended family and social circle that I had abandoned my sister in her time of need, to ensure that I would be an outcast, utterly alone. That was the moment something inside me broke. The pain, the grief, the years of accumulated resentment, all of it coalesced into a single blinding flash of clarity. I looked at their faces, my mother's manufactured tears, my father's righteous fury, and I saw them for what they truly were, emotional vampires who had been feeding on my spirit my entire life. I saw Eleanor not as a victim, but as a black hole pulling everything into her orbit of chaos. And I saw myself for the first time not as a disappointment, but as a survivor. A strange calm washed over me. The suffering had reached its apex, and on the other side of that peak was not a cliff, but a plateau of cold, hard rage. I picked up the papers. I looked my father dead in the eye, and I tore them in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor between us. I told them to get out of my apartment. My voice was quiet, but it held a new authority, an icy resolve that made them both recoil in shock. I told them that they had taken everything from me, my childhood, my confidence, my dreams. I told them that I would not give them my future as well. I told them that Eleanor had made her choices and it was time for her and for them to face the consequences. I told them that if they ever showed up at my home unannounced again, I would call the police. They left sputtering with disbelief and rage, slamming the door behind them. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of despair, but the silence of a battlefield after the enemy has retreated. I stood there for a long time amidst the pieces of their broken contract and my shattered past. The pain was still there, a deep throbbing ache, but it was now overlaid with something new, something powerful purpose. The victim was dead. In her place, something else was being born. My plan began to form that night, not in a rush of emotion, but in a series of cold, logical steps. My target was not simply to hurt them, but to dismantle the one thing they valued above all else, their perfect image. I would not use their weapons of emotional blackmail and brute force. I would use my own observation, intelligence, and the truth. My first act of revenge was small, a single, calculated move. Eleanor's ex-fiancé, David. He was the first domino. My parents had portrayed him as a man who had abandoned Eleanor in her time of need. But I knew better. I knew he was a victim, just like me, caught in the web of Eleanor's lies. I spent an hour online, my fingers flying across the keyboard, a digital detective hunting for a ghost. I found him through a mutual acquaintance on LinkedIn, a senior analyst at a rival firm. His profile picture showed a man with kind eyes but a weary expression. I drafted an email writing and rewriting it a dozen times. I didn't want to sound like a bitter sister or a hysterical mess. I wanted to sound like a seeker of truth. I introduced myself, expressed my condolences for the end of his engagement, and stated simply that I had been told a version of events that I suspected was not entirely accurate. I told him that I was trying to understand the full scope of my sister's problems, not to excuse them, but to protect myself from further fallout. I didn't ask for details of the debt. I asked a single pointed question. Was the car accident a surprise to you? I ended the email by saying that I understood if he didn't want to get involved, but that any insight he could offer would be a lifeline. I hit send, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The waiting was agonizing. For 2 days, there was nothing. I began to think he had deleted it, dismissed it as family drama he wanted no part of. The familiar tendrils of doubt began to creep back in. But then on the third morning, a reply appeared in my inbox. The email was brief, but it was everything I needed. David wrote that he was sorry for what I was going through and that he recognized the pattern of manipulation I had alluded to. He confirmed that the debt was far worse than my parents had let on and that he had discovered a string of lies going back years. Then he answered my question. He told me that the car accident was absolutely not a surprise. He revealed that Eleanor had threatened to do something similar to hurt herself in a way that would make everyone feel sorry for her on at least 2 separate occasions when he had confronted her about her gambling. He said it was her ultimate manipulation tactic, a way to shift the narrative from her being the perpetrator to being the victim. He even attached a screenshot of a text message from a month prior where Eleanor had chillingly written, "If you leave me, you'll be reading about my tragic accident in the papers." I stared at the screenshot, the words blurring through a sudden rush of tears. But these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication. The knot of pain in my chest loosened, replaced by a surge of electrifying satisfaction. It was proof. Concrete, undeniable proof of her manipulation and by extension my parents' complicity in covering it up. The first crack in their perfect facade had appeared and I was the one holding the hammer. This small victory was a balm to my wounded soul. It was a confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that my instincts had been right all along. The suffering that had been my constant companion for weeks began to recede, pushed back by the intoxicating thrill of empowerment. I had been a pawn in their game for 28 years. But now I was changing the rules. I saved David's email and the screenshot to a secure drive. This was just the beginning. I had exposed the first lie. Now it was time to go after the rest of them. The art of destruction, I realized, could be just as creative and far more satisfying than the art of creation. The confirmation from David was more than just a piece of evidence. It was a key unlocking a part of me that had been dormant for 28 years. The part that didn't just absorb pain but learned from it, weaponized it. The suffering hadn't vanished, but it had transmuted, changing from a heavy, crushing weight into a cold, dense core of energy. It was fuel. For the first time, I felt a sense of control, a heady, intoxicating power that was entirely my own. My parents and Eleanor had built their lives on a foundation of lies propped up by my forced sacrifices. Now I would become the architect of their downfall, using the one tool they had never credited me with: my intelligence. My first target had been Eleanor's victim narrative. My next would be far more ambitious. It would strike at the very heart of the Vance family empire, my father's reputation. My father wasn't just a real estate mogul. He was a carefully branded philanthropist. His name was on hospital wings and university libraries. He sat on the boards of numerous charities, his public persona that of a benevolent patriarch, a man who built communities, a pillar of society. It was his most prized possession, more valuable than any skyscraper in his portfolio. And it was a complete and utter fraud. I knew with the deep instinctual certainty of an unloved child that his charity was a performance, his integrity a costume. My plan was to strip it away, leaving him exposed for all the world to see. My weapon, I decided, would be my memory. For years, I had been the ghost in their machine, the quiet observer in the corner of the room, sketching in a notepad while they conducted their lives as if I wasn't there. They had seen a quiet, artistic daughter lost in her own little world. They had never imagined that I was listening, watching, absorbing every detail. Their dismissal of my presence was about to become their greatest liability. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet hum of my Brooklyn apartment fade away, and I traveled back in time. I focused on my father's study in the Greenwich house, a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the faint scent of cigar smoke. I used to sit in there for hours, the light from the large bay window perfect for drawing. I remembered one afternoon about 2 years ago. I was sketching the ancient oak tree outside his window. My father was on the phone, pacing back and forth, his voice a low, agitated murmur. He was discussing a new project, one he was particularly proud of, one that had earned him a humanitarian award from the city. He had called it the Gateway Project, a large-scale, low-income housing development in a struggling neighborhood in the Bronx. Publicly, he had spoken of it with great passion, telling reporters that it was his way of giving back, of providing safe, affordable homes for families in need. But the conversation I overheard that day told a different story. I remember him snapping into the phone, his voice stripped of its philanthropic warmth. He had said that the press tour was a success, but that the profit margins were still too tight. He had told the person on the other end to just find a cheaper supplier for the drywall and the insulation, regardless of the fire rating. I remembered his exact words, seared into my memory by their casual cruelty. He had said that safety codes were for show, that a city inspector could always be persuaded to look the other way for the right price. He had mentioned a name, an architect who was proving to be a problem, a man named Henderson who was making a fuss about ethical obligations. He had ended the call by saying that Mr. Henderson would either get in line or be replaced by someone more flexible. At the time, the conversation had just been background noise, another example of my father's ruthless business dealings, but now it was a roadmap. It was the blueprint for my next move. The investigation began that night. I transformed from an artist into a researcher, my laptop, my new canvas. I started with the Gateway Project. A few clicks brought up a slew of glowing press releases and news articles. There was my father smiling in a hard hat at the groundbreaking ceremony. There he was handing an oversized key to the first family moving in, a carefully selected photogenic family who spoke of him as their savior. The public narrative was flawless, but I dug deeper. I accessed the city's public records database, searching for building permits, inspection reports, and contractor licenses associated with the project. It was a tedious, mind-numbing process, a maze of bureaucratic jargon and scanned documents. But my focus was absolute. I was looking for anomalies, for names. And then I found a list of primary architects and engineers. The original lead architect was listed as a Robert Henderson, but a subsequent document filed 6 months into the project showed a change. Henderson was replaced by a firm I had never heard of, a company with a much smaller, less reputable profile, Robert Henderson. The name from my father's phone call. My heart began to pound a steady, powerful rhythm. This was my way in. Finding him wasn't easy. He wasn't a man who courted the spotlight. He had no flashy website, no active social media presence. But after hours of cross-referencing architectural guilds and old professional directories, I found a possible match, a small independent consulting firm in upstate New York run by a man of the same name. Crafting the email to him was like composing a masterpiece. Every word had to be perfect. I couldn't reveal who I was. The name Vance would shut him down immediately. I created a new anonymous email address, something untraceable. I wrote to him not as an accuser but as a concerned party. I told him I was an independent journalist investigating housing inequalities in New York City. I said that his name had come up in connection with the Gateway Project and that my research indicated he had left the project abruptly. I mentioned that I had heard rumors of disputes over material quality and safety standards. I was careful not to make any direct accusations against my father. Instead, I framed it as an appeal to his conscience. I told him that I had read about his reputation for integrity and that I believed the families living in that building deserved to know the truth about the homes they lived in. I wrote that I understood the professional risks of speaking out, but that the moral risks of silence were sometimes greater. I ended the email with a simple, open-ended question. If there is a story here that needs to be told, I am ready to listen. The next 48 hours were a special kind of hell. I checked my anonymous inbox every 5 minutes, my stomach churning with a mixture of hope and dread. I imagined him deleting it, or worse, forwarding it to my father's legal team. The old feelings of powerlessness tried to resurface, whispering that I was out of my depth, that I was a fool to challenge a man like my father. But then I would look at the screenshot from David, the cold, hard proof of Eleanor's deceit, and the fire in my belly would reignite. I was not that helpless girl anymore. The reply came on a Tuesday night. It was a single cryptic sentence. I have the information you are looking for. How can I be sure you are legitimate and that this will not be traced back to me? My fingers trembled as I typed my response. I assured him of my commitment to anonymity, suggesting we use an encrypted messaging app. I offered to show him my credentials as a freelance writer. I had a few minor online publications to my name, enough to create a plausible persona. I told him my only goal was to expose the truth, not to endanger him. He agreed. That night we connected on the encrypted app. Robert Henderson, it turned out, was a man in his late 50s, his conscience burdened by what he had been forced to walk away from. He told me the whole story. He confirmed that my father had systematically replaced quality fire-resistant materials with cheap, substandard alternatives to cut costs. He had falsified engineering reports and bribed a city inspector to sign off on the project. Henderson had fought him every step of the way until my father had threatened him not with physical violence but with professional ruin, promising to blacklist him from every major firm in the tri-state area. Henderson, with a family to support, had been forced to resign, signing a strict non-disclosure agreement in the process. But he told me he had kept everything. Before he left, he had made copies. He had the original blueprints clearly specifying the required materials. He had the internal memos from my father demanding the use of cheaper alternatives. He had the supplier invoices showing the purchase of the substandard drywall and insulation. He even had a secretly recorded audio file of a meeting where my father explicitly ordered him to make the numbers work and to stop whining about insignificant safety regulations. He said he had been waiting for years for someone to ask the right questions. He sent me a secure password-protected link to a cloud drive. As I downloaded the files, my hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was exhilaration. I opened the first file, a scanned memo from my father's desk, his arrogant signature at the bottom detailing a plan to defraud the city and endanger the lives of hundreds of families, all for the sake of profit. The pain in my chest, the constant ache of 28 years of neglect, receded further. In its place, a feeling of pure, unadulterated triumph surged through me. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was justice. This was for every time he had called my dreams worthless. This was for every time he had looked right through me. This was for every family living in that building, sleeping in homes built on a foundation of greed and lies. The final piece of my plan fell into place with a name: Sarah Jenkins. She was an investigative reporter for the New York Tribune, a tenacious Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist known for her exposés on corporate corruption and social injustice. She was relentless, feared by CEOs and politicians alike. She was perfect. I spent the rest of the night compiling everything into a single comprehensive dossier. I wrote a detailed anonymous cover letter laying out the entire narrative from the public praise to the private corruption. I included Henderson's testimony, David's email about Eleanor's manipulations to establish a pattern of the family's deceit, and of course the damning evidence from the cloud drive. I created a timeline, highlighted key documents, and made the case so clear, so undeniable that no one could possibly ignore it. At 3 a.m., I attached the encrypted file to a new anonymous email. The recipient, Sarah Jenkins. The subject line, "The Truth About the Gateway Project." My finger paused over the send button for a single heart-stopping moment. This was the point of no return. Once this was out in the world, the Vance family as I knew it would cease to exist. Their perfect image would be shattered into a million irreparable pieces. A faint echo of fear, of the conditioned instinct to protect the family, tried to surface. I crushed it without a second thought. I clicked send. A profound sense of calm settled over me. I walked over to my window and looked out at the sleeping city, the distant lights of Manhattan twinkling like fallen stars. The pain of my past was still a part of me, a scar that would never fully fade. But it no longer defined me. For years, my father had been the architect of my misery. Tonight, I had become the architect of his reckoning. The satisfaction was deep, pure, and absolute. The dominoes were set. All I had to do now was wait for them to fall. The waiting was a strange, suspended state of being. The 2 weeks after I sent the email to Sarah Jenkins were both the longest and the calmest of my life. The storm I had unleashed was gathering strength just beyond the horizon, but in my small Brooklyn apartment there was an unnerving quiet. I worked my shifts at the coffee shop, walked the dogs through the autumn-tinged streets of Park Slope, and even cleaned my paintbrushes, lining them up with a meticulous care I hadn't felt in months. I didn't paint. It felt as though I was holding my breath, conserving all my creative and emotional energy for the coming cataclysm. The rage that had fueled me had cooled, solidifying into a state of watchful, patient certainty. I had laid the dynamite and lit the fuse. Now, all I could do was wait for the explosion. It began on a Thursday morning. I was wiping down the counter at the coffee shop, the scent of espresso and steamed milk thick in the air. My phone, lying face down on a shelf, began to buzz incessantly. Not with a single call, but with a flood of notifications, a digital cascade that signaled the breaking of the dam. I wiped my hands on my apron, a tremor of anticipation running through me, and picked it up. The screen was a mosaic of a single devastating image. It was the front page of the New York Tribune's website. The headline in bold, stark letters seemed to scream from the screen, "Vance Realty's Gateway Project, a philanthropic facade built on fraud and danger." Beneath it was a picture of my father, not the usual commanding, smiling portrait from his press photos, but a candid shot of him looking arrogant and dismissive. And below that, the byline, "Sarah Jenkins." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, triumphant drumbeat. She had done it. She had taken my meticulously assembled dossier and transformed it into a masterpiece of investigative journalism. I clicked on the link, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the phone steady. The article was brutal, precise, and utterly damning. Jenkins had not only used every piece of evidence I had provided, but she had built upon it. She had found other disgruntled former employees of Vance Realty who corroborated Henderson's story. She had commissioned an independent engineering firm to discreetly analyze the building's public schematics, and their report raised significant concerns about structural and fire safety. She had even unearthed my father's history of making generous donations to the campaigns of key city officials just before his projects received unusually swift approvals. The most visceral part of the article was the personal testimony. Jenkins had interviewed several families living in the Gateway Project. She spoke to a young mother who worried about the strange cracks appearing in her walls. She spoke to an elderly man who complained about inadequate heating, a direct result of the cheap insulation I knew my father had ordered. These weren't statistics or building codes. They were real people, their lives put at risk by my father's greed. And woven throughout the article like a poisonous thread was the theme of his hypocrisy, the stark, sickening contrast between his public image as a benevolent philanthropist and the private reality of a ruthless, corrupt tycoon. The satisfaction was so potent it was almost dizzying. This was not a quiet, private victory. This was a public execution of his reputation, broadcast for the entire world to see. I felt a grim smile touch my lips. The pain that had been a constant companion for so long was now almost entirely gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of vindication. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. By lunchtime, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country. My father's face was on every screen, his name a trending topic on social media, synonymous with fraud, corruption, and slumlord. The stock price of Vance Realty plummeted, a free fall of catastrophic proportions. The city announced an immediate, full-scale investigation into the Gateway Project and all of my father's other public-private partnerships. The charities he sat on the boards of began issuing statements one after another, announcing they had accepted Mr. Vance's resignation, effective immediately. His name, once a symbol of prestige, had become toxic overnight. My phone, which had been buzzing with news alerts, suddenly started ringing. It was a blocked number. I knew with absolute certainty who it was. I let it go to voicemail. A moment later, another call. Blocked again. I let it ring. And again. And again. A relentless, desperate assault. Finally, a text message came through, a single, furious line from my father. "You did this. Pick up the phone, you treacherous little brat." I didn't reply. I simply took a screenshot of the message and saved it. It was a trophy. The true symphony of their ruin, however, was a performance I wanted a front-row seat for. I knew they would be holed up in the Greenwich estate, the walls of their perfect world crumbling around them. And I knew there was only one thing that would draw me back there, the last piece of my grandmother's will. My grandmother, in her infinite wisdom, had stipulated that a small collection of her personal journals filled with her private thoughts and family memories was to be given to me on my 29th birthday, which was now just a few days away. The executor of the will was my father's own lawyer, a man who, despite the current circumstances, was legally obligated to facilitate the handover. I arranged for it to happen at the estate. I wanted to see their faces. When I arrived in Greenwich, the atmosphere was funereal. The usually immaculate lawns seemed untended, a few stray leaves marring the perfect green. The house itself felt like a mausoleum, the windows dark, the usual air of bustling activity replaced by a tomb-like silence. Mr. Peterson, the lawyer, a man who had known me since I was a child, greeted me at the door. His expression was a mixture of professional discomfort and a flicker of something that looked almost like pity. He led me into the formal living room, a space reserved for important guests, a room I had rarely been allowed to play in as a child. And there they were. My father was standing by the fireplace, a place where his portrait painted in a grand, heroic style used to hang. The wall was now bare, the hook, a small, lonely wound. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in a week. His usually impeccable suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, and his face was a ghastly shade of gray. His eyes, when they met mine, were hollowed out, filled with a mixture of pure, unadulterated hatred and utter soul-crushing defeat. He didn't speak. He just stared, his silence more eloquent than any shout. My mother was huddled on one of the silk sofas, a cashmere throw pulled tightly around her even though the room was warm. She looked fragile, shattered. Her makeup was smudged, her hair was a mess, and her hands trembled as she clutched a teacup. She wouldn't look at me. She just stared into the middle distance, her eyes vacant as if she was watching a ghost. And then I saw Eleanor. She was sitting in a wheelchair near the window, her broken leg propped up on a cushion. The cast was stark white against the dark, oppressive decor of the room. Her face, usually so animated and confident, was pale and puffy, her eyes swollen from crying. When she saw me, a flicker of her old, familiar venom ignited in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by a wave of something else, fear. Pure, primal fear. She looked at me not as a sister, but as a monster, an unstoppable force that had brought this apocalypse upon them. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Mr. Peterson, clearly wanting to get this over with, cleared his throat and presented me with a small, leather-bound box. He told me, his voice formal and strained, that these were my grandmother's journals as stipulated in her will. I took the box, my fingers tracing the worn leather. As I did, my father finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp filled with a despair so profound it was almost shocking. He said he didn't understand. He asked why. He said that he had given me everything, that they had given me everything. He said he was my father. The words were not an accusation, but a plea, the desperate cry of a king who had been dethroned and couldn't comprehend how his own insignificant subject had managed to topple his empire. Before I could answer, my mother began to speak, her voice a high, thin wail. She wasn't speaking to me, but to the room, to the ghosts of her shattered social life. She lamented that their friends wouldn't even answer her calls. She cried that the invitation to the annual governor's ball had been discreetly withdrawn. She sobbed that her entire life, everything she had worked for, was gone. Her grief was not for her husband's crimes or her daughter's destructive behavior. It was for the loss of her status, the death of her image. It was the most pathetic and the most honest I had ever seen her be. It was Eleanor, however, who finally directed her rage at me. Pushing herself up slightly in her wheelchair, she pointed a trembling finger at me. She said that I was a monster, a snake they had raised in their own home. She said that I had always been jealous of her and that this was my sick, twisted way of getting revenge. She screamed that I had destroyed her life, that I had destroyed the entire family, all because I couldn't stand to see her happy, to see her succeed. I let her words wash over me, feeling nothing but a distant clinical pity. Her accusations were so predictable, so perfectly aligned with the self-absorbed narrative she had lived her entire life. I turned to face her, my expression calm, my voice even. I told her that she had destroyed her own life long before I ever got involved. I told them all that they had built their family on a foundation of lies, secrets, and cruelty, and that all I had done was hold up a mirror. I told my father that he wasn't a philanthropist. He was a criminal who had endangered innocent lives for profit. I told my mother that she wasn't a loving matriarch. She was a shallow socialite who valued appearances more than her own children's well-being. And I told Eleanor that she wasn't a victim. She was a manipulative addict who had used her family's toxic dynamics to avoid taking responsibility for her actions her entire life. I then delivered the final crushing blow. I looked directly at Eleanor, my voice dropping to a near whisper, ensuring every word landed with surgical precision. I told her I knew about the accident. I told her I had spoken to David. I told her I knew it was a calculated act of self-harm, another desperate attempt to manipulate everyone around her. The effect was instantaneous. The color drained from Eleanor's face, leaving it a waxy, translucent white. Her mouth fell open, a silent gasp of horror. My parents stared at her, then back at me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning dread. They had been so consumed by my father's public implosion that they hadn't even considered this private, more insidious deception. They saw it in my eyes, the cold, hard certainty of the truth. In that moment, the last vestiges of their family's twisted solidarity shattered. They were no longer a united front against me. They were just three broken, betrayed individuals trapped in the ruins of their own making. I watched them, a long, satisfying moment of pure, silent devastation. I saw my father finally look at Eleanor, not with concern but with a flicker of disgust. I saw my mother stare at her firstborn, her perfect daughter, as if seeing a monster for the first time. I saw Eleanor shrink back in her wheelchair, utterly exposed, her most powerful weapon, her victimhood, rendered useless. I had done it. I had not only torn down their public image, but I had planted a seed of permanent, irreversible poison within the family itself. They would never trust each other again. Their perfect family was not just broken, it was annihilated from the inside out. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, clutching my grandmother's journals to my chest. I didn't look back. As I closed the heavy front door behind me, the sound echoed through the silent house, a final definitive period at the end of a long, painful chapter. I walked down the long driveway, the cool autumn air feeling clean and fresh against my skin. The profound suffering that had defined my existence was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, expansive sense of peace. The symphony of their ruin was complete, and its final note was the beautiful, liberating sound of my own footsteps walking away. The drive back to Brooklyn was a study in contrasts. Outside my car, the world was in an uproar. News radio channels provided a running commentary on the Vance Realty scandal, with legal experts speculating on the imminent criminal charges against my father. But inside the car, there was only a profound and welcome silence. The heavy, oppressive weight that had sat on my chest for as long as I could remember had finally lifted. I felt light, almost ethereal, as if I had shed a skin I had been trapped in for 28 years. The fire of my revenge had burned itself out, leaving not ash and desolation but clean, open ground. Back in my apartment, the scent of turpentine and oil paint greeted me like an old friend. I placed the leather-bound box containing my grandmother's journals on my small kitchen table, but I didn't open it right away. I felt a need to sit with the silence, to let the new reality of my freedom settle into my bones. For years, my life had been a reaction to their actions, a constant state of bracing for the next dismissal, the next demand, the next act of casual cruelty. Now there was nothing. The power they held over me was gone, not because they had relinquished it, but because I had taken it back, dismantled it piece by piece, and scattered its remains to the wind. The days that followed were a period of quiet reclamation. I woke up not to the dread of a potential phone call, but to the gentle morning light filtering through my window. I worked my shifts at the coffee shop, the mundane rhythm of grinding beans and steaming milk feeling grounding, real. I started painting again. My first piece was not of a fractured cityscape or a shadowed figure, but a simple, almost abstract study of light, a single brilliant beam cutting through an expanse of deep, velvety darkness. It was a painting about the moment after the storm, the first breath of clean air. The news of my family's continued unraveling reached me in detached fragments, like reports from a distant foreign war. My father was formally indicted on multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and reckless endangerment. Vance Realty filed for bankruptcy. The Greenwich estate was put up for sale to cover legal fees and mounting debts. My mother, stripped of her social standing and her wealth, had apparently suffered a nervous breakdown and was staying with her sister in Florida, a quiet exile from the world she had once so proudly dominated. And Eleanor. Her fate was perhaps the most tragic and the most fitting. With the truth of her accident revealed, whatever remaining sympathy my parents had for her evaporated. Left to fend for herself, facing the consequences of her actions for the first time in her life, she had checked herself into a long-term rehabilitation facility, not a discreet luxury clinic, but a state-funded program for addiction and personality disorders. The golden child, stripped of her gilded cage, was finally forced to confront the broken person within. I felt no joy in their suffering. The burning satisfaction of my revenge had cooled into a more somber, reflective state. My goal had not been to make them miserable, but to make them accountable. To force them to see the truth they had so carefully, so cruelly hidden from the world and from themselves. Their pain was not my victory, my freedom was. One rainy Saturday afternoon, I finally felt ready to open the box. I brewed a cup of tea, sat at my table, and gently untied the ribbon holding the journals together. The pages were filled with my grandmother Evelyn's elegant, flowing script. They were not just a record of her days, but a window into her soul, and through her eyes, a window into the truth of my family. As I read, a new, more profound and more painful understanding began to dawn. My grandmother had seen it all. She had seen the toxic dynamic, the burgeoning narcissism in my parents, the calculated manipulations of Eleanor, and the quiet, slow erasure of me. Her entries were filled with a deep, sorrowful love and a profound sense of helplessness. One entry from when I was 10 stood out. She wrote about my 10th birthday, the one overshadowed by Eleanor's science fair award. My grandmother wrote that she had seen the quiet disappointment in my eyes and that she had confronted my mother about it. She described how my mother had become defensive, saying that Eleanor was special and had enormous potential that needed to be nurtured at all costs, while I was a sweet, simple child who didn't require as much attention. My grandmother had written her words a lament on the page that she feared they were not raising two daughters but one idol and one shadow. Another entry from when I was in high school detailed the cheating incident. My grandmother wrote with barely concealed fury about how my parents had knowingly sacrificed my integrity to protect Eleanor's reputation. She wrote that she had told my father he was teaching his daughters a terrible lesson, that lies were rewarded and that truth was a liability. She wrote that my father had dismissed her concerns, saying she was being overly dramatic and that he was simply being a practical parent. The final line of that entry sent a shiver down my spine. She had written that she feared one day the cost of their practicality would be a price too high for any of them to pay. The most heartbreaking and most illuminating discovery was a letter tucked into the final journal addressed to me. It was dated just a few months before she passed away. She must have known her time was short. In the letter she spoke to me directly, her voice rising from the page with a clarity and love that brought tears to my eyes. She told me she was leaving me the Vermont property not just as a piece of land but as an escape, a sanctuary, a tangible piece of a world away from their influence. She wrote that she knew I was the strongest of them all, not because I could handle disappointment as my parents so often claimed, but because I had managed to keep my gentle creative soul alive in a household that sought to smother it. Then came the part that changed everything. She wrote that she knew Eleanor was not just difficult but unwell in a way my parents refused to see. She revealed that she had once tried to get Eleanor into therapy as a teenager after discovering a pattern of compulsive lying and a shocking lack of empathy. But my parents had refused, horrified at the suggestion that their perfect daughter could be flawed, terrified of the social stigma. They had chosen image over health, illusion over reality. She wrote that she feared they had created a monster not out of malice but out of a profound and willful blindness. She ended the letter with a piece of advice that felt like a final, precious gift. She told me that sometimes the most loving act is to walk away. She wrote that my loyalty was a beautiful thing but that it should be reserved for those who valued it, who nurtured it, not for those who saw it as a resource to be exploited. She wrote that true family is not about blood but about truth, respect, and the quiet, unwavering support for the dreams of the ones you love. She told me to build my own family, to find my own tribe, and to never, ever apologize for the space I deserved to take up in the world. I closed the journal, tears streaming down my face. They were not tears of pain but of a deep, cathartic release. My grandmother had not been a helpless observer. She had been my silent champion, my secret advocate. She had seen me, truly seen me, and she had given me the one thing I had always craved: permission to save myself. The journals were not just a validation of my experience, they were a roadmap for my future. A few weeks later I received a letter. It was from Eleanor, sent from the rehabilitation facility. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, a stark contrast to her usual confident scrawl. It was a long, rambling letter filled with the raw, unfiltered language of someone just beginning the arduous process of self-examination. She didn't ask for forgiveness. The word never appeared. Instead, she just told her story, the one she had hidden behind the mask of perfection for so long. She wrote of the immense pressure to be the best, the constant fear of disappointing our parents, a fear that had mutated into a desperate, all-consuming need for external validation. She wrote about how the gambling had started as a thrill, a secret world where she was in control, but had quickly spiraled into an addiction that devoured her life. In one devastatingly honest paragraph, she wrote about me. She admitted that she had resented me not because I was a rival, but because I had something she never did, an inner world, a passion that was entirely my own, something that didn't depend on our parents' approval. She said she had tried to destroy it in me because she couldn't stand the sight of a freedom she had never allowed herself to possess. It wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation, a glimpse into the profound sickness at the core of her being. I read the letter twice, then folded it and put it away. I didn't know if I would ever reply. Reconciliation felt like a distant, impossible shore. But the letter did give me one final unexpected gift, a sense of closure. The monster I had fought was not just a person. It was a disease, a generational sickness born from a toxic obsession with perfection. My life now is quiet and it is my own. I sold the Vermont property not out of necessity but out of choice. I used the money to buy my small Brooklyn apartment and the storefront below it, which is now the Chloe Vance Gallery, a small independent space dedicated to showcasing emerging local artists. It's a tribute to the woman who taught me the true meaning of legacy. I am not the same person who cowered in the shadow of her family. The scar of their perfection is still there, a faint, silvery line on my soul, but it is no longer a source of pain. It is a reminder of the battle I fought and the freedom I won. It is a testament to the fact that our greatest works of art are not always the ones we create on a canvas, but the lives we have the courage to build for ourselves out of the wreckage of the past, guided by the quiet architecture of our own truth.